Thank you very much, Dave. And in Norwich, we like to say not Norwich City, but Premiership Norwich City. And thank you for your introduction. It's true that I was an advisor for a lot of years in the Treasury before becoming elected, and then getting into government, and now in opposition, Dave. But just to tell you a story, which is a totally true story, which completely fits in with your introduction. I was back in 2002-03, around the time of the Euro. The Times had this poll, or this list of unelected politicians in Britain and how powerful they were, and I was quite high up the list in the time as a chief advisor. And then one day I was on the train on the way up to Hamilton in Scotland to the Coalfield Communities annual conference, and I had a call on my mobile phone from Gordon Brown, and I answered it. I was just north of Darlington, and he said, "Have you seen this week's Economist?" And I said I hadn't. And he said, "The Economist has got a list of the 100 most important policymakers in Britain." This is in about 2004, before I was elected. The 100 most important policymakers in Britain, he says, and congratulations, he said, "You're second." And I thought, that's a bit surprising. I'd bought a copy of the magazine, hadn't read it. He said, "Which is great," he said, "but why am I only 19th? And I scrabbled around in my bag looking for the magazine. He said, Gordon Brown said, "I understand why Tony Blair's above me." He said, I think it was a particularly understanding mood he was in that day. I understand Tony Blair's above me, but why is Margaret Beckett above him? And I found my copy of the magazine, found the list. I said, "Gordon, I think you'll find it's alphabetical." Which explained why, according to The Economist, the most important policymaker in Britain was Jerry Adams in the list on that particular. Anyway, I wasn't going to tell that joke, but it just sort of fitted with Dave's introduction. It's a great honour to be here today and to address you, to come back again, this time in my role as Shadow Chancellor and not the Education, the Children's Secretary, and to come and talk to you at a really important time for our economy, with the economy in recession, with unemployment high, but also at a time when this community, the local government community, is facing the biggest challenge that you've faced in a generation. Huge financial pressures, the earliest and the biggest cuts in spending faced by any part of the public sector, but also rising demographic pressures alongside that, as the cost of our ageing society puts pressures on your budgets. Financial pressures which are graphically set out, I've seen in the Barnett graph of doom, but also very powerfully in the LGA's analysis, which you published earlier this week, of the funding outlook for local government up to the end of this decade. And I have to say, having read that this week, that should be required reading for every government minister and for every shadow minister as well. There's issues in there which we can't duck. We can't bury our heads in the sand and hope the issues you raise in that report will go away. And I'll come back to those issues in the course of my speech. But I think it is true to say that we are entering a new and more difficult era for local government, and it's really important that we work together to make sure that we emerge stronger from these times, not weaker. And I recognise not just the financial pressures, but alongside that, the rising expectations and expectations of local government. If you talk to the police chiefs, I met the chief constable of Birmingham, of Greater Birmingham Police Force, when I was the Shadow Home Secretary, and he said the cuts in the NHS in adult mental health services will directly impact upon the pressure on policing. And if you talk to our hospital trusts, they will say that cuts or changes in the incentives for GPs will directly impact upon what happens in our A&E departments. But that's true for the police and for the NHS, but it is doubly true for local government, because in all those areas, whether it's antisocial behaviour, whether it's rising pressures on beds and the cost of care in the community, whether it's what happens to homelessness, in the end, what we all know is that the service, which is facing bigger cuts than the NHS, bigger cuts even than the police, local government will end up being the service of last resort, the place where people will go expecting things to be sorted out community by community. And that's before you take account of floods and Olympics and jubilees and all the other issues which you pick up day by day, week by week, year by year. And I want to start by saying, over the last 2 years, I've been really struck in the dealings I've had with the local government across the country, across England, and in Scotland and Wales, not just Labour, but Conservative and Liberal Democrat councils as well, by the quiet and determined and responsible way our local government leaders have responded to these pressures in the last 2 years. Of course, you aren't strangers to challenges. This is unprecedented, this squeeze, but for a very long time, you faced rising expectations alongside financial pressure and have looked to change and reform and squeeze out efficiency. When I spoke at this conference last in 2008 as the Children's Secretary, we were dealing with real pressures around child protection, around school improvement. And I would just like to say I worked really closely with Margaret Eaton when she was the head of the LGA, and I think she was a real advocate for local government services, but also for your leadership on those matters. And then, as now, you recognise that in difficult times, local government had to rise to the challenge and always do so in a way which faced towards the communities you represent and are always listening to what they tell you are their priorities and their concerns. And that is why I do think over the last 2 years you've responded in that same way, in a measured and tough, and I would say quite visionary way. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to say that to you today. That's my view. I very much hope the Secretary of State will say the same things to you when he speaks this afternoon. And I would just like to say to Sir Merrill Cockle, thank you for your balanced leadership over the last year. To my old friend and the leader of the Labour group, Dave Sparks, thank you for your advice. To the council leaders I work very closely with in Wakefield and in Leeds, Peter Box and Keith Wakefield, thank you for the very disciplined and determined way you've gone about things over the last 2 years and more as we face the consequences of the financial crisis. And because it is invariably the councillor, the council officer, who is expected to pick up the pieces when things are difficult or hard. A big thank you to all the staff, senior to the most junior, in all our councils up and down the country for doing such a great job over the last few years, but also as we face difficult emergencies like the floods. I know you're expecting me, and Dave sort of slightly hinted at this, you're expecting me to come along and say that I've got big differences with the coalition on the economy and on local government and public services more widely. And I don't want to disappoint. But although, you know, in a spirit of consensus, let me just say, David Cameron did rather single me out last year, called me the most annoying person in British politics. But my accolade only lasted for 4 days because the Sunday Times did an opinion poll. They asked the public who is the most annoying person in British politics. Turns out David Cameron is just as annoying as me, according to the British people. George Osborne is more annoying. Nick Clegg is even more annoying. I think probably Eric Pickles is even more annoying. I'm not sure if he was in the list. But top of the poll, it's still Peter Mandelson after all this time. Peter and I, we're working hard to make sure we remain annoying to government ministers. But I want to start from a different place, in a spirit of consensus, because the LGA works on consensus where you can. I want to say, on the big issues facing us, deficit reduction, efficiency and reform, our long-term plan for jobs and growth, I want to start by saying where we agree, where George Osborne, David Cameron, Eric Pickles and I can agree on these big issues. First of all, we have a global financial crisis, which we're dealing with the consequence of. We know we need tougher bank regulation, and we see very clearly today in the news about Barclays, which will go more wide in the coming weeks, the real culture of irresponsibility which caught hold of these financial institutions in the last decade in our country. We need tougher regulation, but we also need credible deficit reduction plans. There's no doubt about that. Whoever was in government needed a credible plan. Whoever was in government would have been delivering a tight settlement to local government. There would have had to have been cuts in spending, pensions needed reform, there would have been pay restraint. With the economy back in recession, borrowing now rising again, those pressures are going to continue into the next parliament, whoever wins the next election. And I know you understand this, and the LGA report you published this week sets out graphically the consequences of where we are, and the decisions which we face for the future. And I would just like to say, too, I appreciate how hard many of you have worked with local trade unions to find ways to make savings and keep control on cost and pay, which has allowed you, in many cases, to avoid so far the kind of wholesale compulsory redundancies, which are such a threat to security, to living standards, and to well-being. But we understand that there's consensus about the challenge and the need for a credible plan on the deficit. Secondly, there is a consensus that tight budgets mean you can't just muddle through and try to do the same things, but just with less money. Perhaps to your surprise, I'm going to disagree with him in a little bit, but to your surprise, I'm going to quote Eric Pickles from one of his early statements when he became the Secretary of State, where he said, there is a choice for councils. They can panic, he said they can panic, they can slash and burn services regardless of the impact that will have, or they can take the opportunity to completely rethink everything they are doing, creating a modern, flexible and innovative council. And the reality is, it doesn't need Eric Pickles or me to say that, because the reality is that's what local government is doing and has been doing for a number of years, searching for radical approaches to efficiency, looking for new ways to generate resources, also finding ways to get others to do more and share a bigger part of the burden of delivery. That was fundamental to Total Place, greater cooperation, greater pooling, greater devolution alongside accountability. It's fundamental to the vision, at least, of this government's talk about localism and the voluntary sector. And I think the government needs to do more to recognise the hard work which you have been doing and are doing to rise to that efficiency and reform challenge, the bringing together of back office functions and senior management, which is being done in the Vale of Whitehorse and South Oxfordshire, or South Northamptonshire and Cherwell, or in South West London across Merton, Croydon, Richmond and Sutton, in Oxford, the way in which a strong relationship between employers and unions have been trying to make sure we put jobs first. The move towards mutualisation of housing in Rochdale, the way Lambeth has been leading devolution. And I would just like to say, as a Leeds MP as well, that the leadership from Keith Wakefield and Tom Reardon in Leeds with Cardiff and Glasgow on the new commission, which they've been working on to rethink local government services, how to drive enterprise, to build new partnerships, to get the best deals for towns and cities. This isn't just finding savings here or there. This is trying to rethink the whole model of service delivery and what a future vision of local government looks like. And we should say, this is what you have been doing. You are leading this process. And again, I do hope that the Secretary of State acknowledges that when he speaks to you this afternoon. And that takes me to my third area of consensus, the central importance to our country of a long-term plan for growth and for jobs. We agree on that. And I'm told there was a really good session yesterday with Peter Box and the CBI talking about how local government must be at the centre of our work on job creation and investment. And that is right, and that is what you're doing. Here in Birmingham, we've got the council working on the Science Park in Aston, on apprenticeships, on the new train station for New Street. There are so many other examples. Cambridgeshire Council investing in broadband, Sheffield in apprenticeships, Liverpool trying to replace the funding in part for the cancellation of building schools for the future, one of the most short-sighted decisions I can remember a government making in my lifetime. Deficit reduction, efficiency and reform, a long-term plan for jobs and growth. I can agree with coalition ministers on these challenges. I'm sure many of you will agree too. The question is, how do we rise to those challenges? What do we do? How do we make sure we deliver those objectives? On the deficit first, we need a plan which works, which gets the deficit down. But what we've argued consistently, of course there has to be tax rises and spending cuts, but if the economy is not growing, you don't make things better, you make things worse, and it's not going to be a surprise to you that I think George Osborne and David Cameron got this plan wrong. The plan we had alongside tougher regulation, was for a deficit reduction plan, but getting people back to work, getting the economy growing, the work of the Future Jobs Fund, the temporary VAT cut, and tax and spending decisions, but once the recovery was being secured and could be nurtured. The new coalition said, we've got a different approach. They said we should go faster on deficit reduction. They said, rather than talking about jobs and growth, we should go immediately to India's spending cuts and the VAT rise. They said the faster the cuts in public services and public jobs, the bigger the boost to private confidence, enterprise, and job creation. And the reality is, since the spending review of 2010, our economy has now not grown at all. In fact, we've contracted over nearly 18 months by 0.4%, while America has now recovered all the output lost in the recession and the financial crisis since 2007. We still lag well behind. Our recovery was choked off well before the growing and very serious problems we now face from the Eurozone. Unemployment's high. Borrowing is rising again. The government is now, this Parliament, borrowing £150 billion more than they planned, more borrowing than the plans they inherited from us in this Parliament. Because if, in the end, if the economy's not growing and if people aren't in work and they're not paying taxes and benefit bills are rising, that doesn't make the deficit better. It makes it worse. And that's why we have consistently said, look, local government is doing its bit, but without national government effort to support growth and jobs, the danger is we're in for a long, slow growth decade of high unemployment, which will leave a permanent dent in our prosperity. And that's why I've said, you've got to act now. A credible plan has got to get the economy moving. A temporary VAT cut, repeat the bank bonus tax for youth jobs, a national insurance cut for small businesses, bring forward infrastructure investment. These are things which are an essential part of a credible deficit reduction plan alongside tough decisions on tax and spend. And we've now had U-turns from the Chancellor on charities, churches, caravans, pasties, fuel and skips. But we need more. And until we get to a balanced plan on the economy, until we understand that you need a growth plan to make your deficit reduction plan work, that austerity alone is self-defeating, we aren't going to make progress. And that's my first big area of disagreement with the coalition. Secondly, on efficiency and service reform, I think there is a real pattern here developing. Look at what's happening in policing. We asked in government the Independent Police Inspectorate to tell us what could be delivered on not just first-year cuts, but genuine service reform. And they said 12% over 4 years, faster and earlier than that, will damage frontline services. The government said, that's not right. 20% cut, front-end loaded. The result is we're now losing 16,000 police officers over the next few years. The Prime Minister says we won't do anything that will reduce the amount of visible policing on our streets. And we already know we've already lost 5,000 police officers from 999 response units, traffic cops and neighbourhood police. That is the front line. And what's the response from the Home Office? Angry denunciations of police professionalism, working practices and leadership, which may sound familiar, because you've certainly had the denunciations over the last few years. Your Secretary of State signed up to the fastest and the earliest cuts in spending. I think the problem was that was never going to be consistent with a proper approach to service redesign and efficiency. As one business leader said to me when we were talking about this a few weeks ago, any company can achieve faster in-year cuts. But the question is, what does that do to your skills, to your innovation, to your investment? Do you end up permanently weakened as a result of going faster in the short term? And as Hilary Benn, our shadow local government minister, has pointed out, that is made doubly hard by the skewed way in which these cuts are falling, with the 10% most deprived upper-tier authorities facing a 4 times greater reduction in their spending than the least deprived authorities. The result is inevitable early cuts in frontline service provision. And with the police, I'm afraid so the view from Whitehall seems to be it's local government's fault. And I don't think that's fair. As the LGA report says this week, the danger is that if you have spending cuts at this pace, you end up doing long-term damage, that efficiency savings can only be part of the solution. There's only so far you can go in decentralizing politically difficult cuts, that we have to look at radical options on social care, on councils working together, on engaging with the wider community. If we don't face up to those issues together, we end up with a race to the bottom form of localism. And my fear, too, is that goes to the heart of growing concerns about the big society vision of localism and voluntary action. I suspect there will be a degree of scepticism in this audience about the government's true commitment now to localism after central diktats on rubbish collection, police and crime and commissioners, on referendums on mayors, on the decentralisation of housing benefit powers in the person of the Secretary of State. Also the issue of local government finance and the localisation of business rates. It does seem to be very odd to announce the localisation of business rates as a step forward for localism and then subsequently announce the Treasury is going to top slice a very substantial share of the proceeds from business rates and not, I should say, to pay for a necessary and highly desirable redistribution scheme to cushion the blow for those local authorities most hard hit. Surely it would have been better for ministers and local government to sit down, work out a plan together which works for local government and achieves collective objectives, and then announce it after you've had the discussions. And that is the approach I would like to take in our finance discussions with local government in the coming year. As I said, though, this issue of the big society does worry me greatly, because my fear is, in the big society vision, there's a gaping hole where public provision needs to be. We live in Castleford. Every weekend, mums and dads organise local football leagues. Voluntary action. No public funding from the local authority. Voluntary action has been there for years. But we play football on astroturfs in newly built secondary schools. On Saturdays, caretakers turn up to open the gates. All those things require public funding to support that voluntary activity. And the question is, will that continue? And do you have the resources for that kind of support? In my constituency, we have a brilliant scheme called Home Start, the forerunner of Sure Start. Volunteers supporting families in distress, but underpinned by very important local authority support to make that possible. As Ed Miliband said to you last year, you can't volunteer in your local library if it's been shut. Take the issue of homelessness. It's a local authority responsibility. We have a great tradition of voluntary action in tackling homelessness, delivering services for homeless people. I've met very many organisations who are involved in that who are not directly public sector organisations in the voluntary and third sector. But we've seen a 17% rise in homelessness over the last year, the first year of the government. We've seen budgets cuts, including to voluntary organisations as well. I don't think it's possible for the big society to solve the homelessness crisis unless local government is able and financed to work in partnership to deliver those objectives. And at a time when we have a crisis in housing supply, when we're told we need 4.5 million more households in the next 25 years, the scale of the cuts to funding for house building is not consistent with that vision. Without leadership and investment and a long-term plan, it's not going to work. And I don't hear that from the Prime Minister when he talks about the big society vision. Which brings me to my third area of concern, jobs and growth. Again, my fear is that ideology is getting in the way of clear thinking. And whether it's backtracking on large-scale planning reform, the abolition of the RDAs, I fear the current Treasury view, at least, is if you simply get government out of the way, that delivers the jobs and growth and enterprise and confidence we need. But I'm not sure if that 19th century liberal vision is really consistent with the 21st century economy. It's not the approach they take in Germany. It's not actually the approach they take in America either. And I'm not sure whether simply the state withdrawing is going to deliver in business. I understand why the business secretary said that there isn't a vision for the government at the moment. Because in the end, on transport, on planning, on skills, on strategic industrial support, government has to play its role if we're going to have a modern jobs and growth plan. It's always important to keep government under pressure on spending and regulation. But if you get those things out of the way, if you go back to an old-style British debate, public good, private bad, private good, public bad, the old ideological disputes, and you don't recognise that it's actually about partnership between business and government that you really create the environment for job creation, we can't succeed. And at the centre of that has got to be the role of local government and economic development. We try to recognise that through, for example, the return of business rate growth through the LABG. My decision when I became Secretary of State to transfer the commissioning of education and training for 16 to 19-year-olds back to local government. Two examples. There are many others recognising the important role that local government must play as a leading engine for growth and jobs in our economy. I fear we're going in the opposite direction. I'm not going to say we got everything right because we didn't. I'm not going to say the RDAs were perfect because they weren't. I remember going to meet the RDA here in the West Midlands to be told, I can't believe this terrible Learning and Skills Council running things from Whitehall. And I said, the Learning and Skills Council is based in Coventry. And the chair of the RDA said, but they could be in Timbuktu for all the engagement they have with us as an RDA and with local communities. But what they did do is bring strategic thinking in partnership with local authorities to our regions and actually increasingly to the sub-regional economies, the areas where we needed to make policy which crossed traditional local authority divides, particularly housing, transport, and skills. I remember coming to Birmingham around the time of the opening of the new line and talking to people here who said, how do we explain to the new Chinese owners at Longbridge that the people who brokered this deal to make it possible for your investment, Advantage West Midlands, has been abolished by the government since you decided to put the money in? The government is trying to hand that strategic role over to the local economic partnerships, the LEPs, to tens and tens of them. There are some good LEPs. In my constituency, in our area, in the Leeds sub-region, we are working closely with our LEP. We want it to succeed, but compared to the RDAs even, and the RDAs didn't have enough of this, the LEPs don't have the capacity or the resources or the levers to do the job they're being asked to do. And I think this has got to be addressed more quickly than we're hearing. It's a good thing that Greg Clark is talking about some devolution in transport, housing, skills. In our area, the city deal won't simply be for Leeds, but for the city region. But it's still narrow and arbitrary and chaotic. Why should our counties and market towns be excluded from that discussion about the levers local government needs to lead in economic development? And that's why Ed Miliband and Hilary Benn have proposed we need to think more radically about an English New Deal on devolution. And I want economic powers to be at the centre of that new deal. But there is a wider point here. I've talked about the three areas where I disagree on the how, but the consensus on what we're trying to do. It's always frustrating for business and for local government when the goalposts keep changing. There's no doubt these days in sectors like energy or aviation, manufacturing as well, unless you have some long-term stability, some consensus which can last beyond a party or a parliament, you're not going to be able to have the stability which will encourage business to invest in these long-term areas. But the same thing is true for local government as well. Unless we have some consistency and some consensus and some honesty about the challenges we face, we aren't going to make progress. I know one area where you're all deeply worried, the future of the delivery and the funding of high-quality social care. Without a cross-party consensus, we can't make progress on social care. That's why our party called for cross-party talks. And we want to work with the government and with you to try to find a long-term funding solution on social care. The same thing has got to be applied in local government finance as well. Consensus isn't always a good thing, but nor is headline-grabbing change for the sake of it. Different governments, national and local, will have different priorities. But since the debacle of the poll tax, no party has found a fair or sustainable way forward for the financing of local government. Unless we build a lasting consensus about powers, accountability, and the tax base, we can't move forward. And I hope we can. And I hope that the government will respond, because the challenge is urgent. And if a race to the bottom, localism, is the alternative, we have to do better than that. Let me just end by saying this, Dave. During my time as Secretary of State for Education, we had some difficult issues to deal with in the children's world, and it was hard. And I learned some important lessons. On the one hand, the national government can't just walk away when things go wrong, that parliamentary accountability matters, that the public and the media won't allow that to happen, that the public wants the best service everywhere, that there is a dilemma in localism, which is that it's not good enough to be told it's really good, the education system or the child protection system in a particular part of Yorkshire if you live in the southwest. And there's always a pressure at times of stress towards centralism. It does seem to me that under financial pressure at the moment, we are in danger of lurching towards a skewed and more centralised system of local government finance. But that pressure has got to be resisted, because it's also the case, I learned, that in the end, you could only make progress if the leadership comes from the local. The council leader, the lead member for children's services, the DCS, senior staff, councillors backed by the leader and the chief executive, that we have to back the front line and their leadership if you're to make progress, that people need to know who's responsible and accountable when things go well or badly. National government can set directions. I think we did that successfully in the laming work around social work reform, but ministers and officials in Whitehall cannot micromanage public service delivery. That just stifles creativity, innovation, leadership. It can't work. It overrides local priorities. And the right approach is maximal devolution of decision-making, powers, priority setting, and finance too, alongside strong accountability and transparency. This isn't an easy time to be a councillor, but it is a time when leadership and new thinking are needed more than ever, and they have to start from this community. They can't be imposed by the centre. And I think we Westminster politicians have got to be clear that we value the dedication of the people who are leading the delivery of and the defence of decent local public services, and that we listen too carefully when local government leaders ring the alarm bell, as you did powerfully this week. The LGA has a crucial role to play. Ministers ignore you at their peril. And we won't always agree on every issue. But I hope, by working together, and I'm deeply committed to that, we can forge a new and lasting consensus on the way forward and back your vision and leadership. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Ed. We've got time for a couple of questions. We've got 5 minutes left. Got one there, and then we'll have one down at the front.
Morning, Ed. My name is Councillor Mick Burnett, Deputy Leader of North East Links Council. I clearly agree with the whole heartment and the sentiments that you said in your wonderful speech this morning. But one of the things you never touched on, which is going to be my question, what is your views on tourism? I'm lucky to represent Cleethorpes along with my colleagues on my left, and I just think is that we need to talk about tourism. As I'm sure you're aware, it's the 6th biggest industry in the country, and I just want to know your views out.
I'll best, in terms of time, take a few. So sure. I'll take this one over here. I am pointing over there. Thank you.
Hi there. My name's Gurpreet Sandhu. I work with Accenture. I'm also an activist in the Labour Party, and but the most interesting and relevant bit of what I do is I work for a third sector community faith-based organisation called Sangat Television. And you briefly touched on the need for government to try to engage with perhaps faith-based or charitable organisations. And we of course know about the big society agenda within the Conservative Party. What would you suggest from a Labour perspective, and this goes out to Ed, could be done, or what would you advocate doing in terms of engaging with people and engaging with faith-based and charitable organisations?
I'd take one more at the back there near the camera. That's it.
Hi, Ed. Chuck Berry from Wiltshire. The last time I saw you, you were 25 miles into the marathon and looking canary yellow, probably regretting the last Delia Smith sandwich you'd had in the 101 Club. Anyway, notwithstanding that, sometimes I think you ask too much. So when you ask for a reduction in VAT, it's too much. Why not, from an SME perspective, look to defer VAT payments by 90 days? The money will come straight to us. We don't have to borrow it from the banks. You can charge as a Treasury 3% or something like that. So suggest that when you ask, have you got it right, boy?
Okay, Ed, then over to you.
Right. I think at the moment we should be thinking of any way we can to support small business. And if there's ways around the payment system or around the VAT system where we can do more to help, we should, and that should be on the table. And one of the things I've suggested is that the government had a national insurance scheme which they said was going to help hundreds of thousands of small firms, but only small firms taking on new and additional workers. And it basically hasn't really helped very many companies at all. We should actually apply that to all small companies for all of their workforce at the moment. That would help. But in the end, we've got to get something bigger going in the economy. And I don't think interest rates and quantitative easing can make the difference. And the reality is that the VAT cut in 2008-9 made a big difference. It helped us to get the economy moving again. And I think it's the right thing to do again. I do think that George Osborne's decision to raise VAT at the beginning of last year was a catastrophic decision for the economy. It will end up costing us more. So in a way, I want to think big. Actually, by 25 miles, I was feeling better. I had a much harder time around 13 miles. It's a terrible dilemma whether you do the marathon as an opposition politician, because the phrase, it's a marathon, not a sprint, is a really good phrase to sum up our political challenge, so long as you finish. If, on the other hand, you collapse at mile 15, you're in a lot of trouble. So anyway, got to the end. In terms of Sangat's point about faith-based organisations, the reality is that local government has been leading on this agenda for some years, particularly around Prevent and wider work on community cohesion to make sure that we were supporting all young people, and also in the way in which we've been supporting and encouraging, for example, faith schools to be part of the wider community and to take their responsibilities seriously. And I'm a big supporter of faith-based education, but it must be done in the right way. And so I actually think that rather than central government telling you how to do it, I think that the experience is in this room rather than in Whitehall about how you engage faith-based organisations in community cohesion and wider public service delivery. Finally, tourism. Wakefield is the rhubarb capital of Europe. We have in Wakefield an annual rhubarb festival. It's a major tourist draw, and I don't know why you're laughing. And people come from all over the world to experience Wakefield forced rhubarb. It's on the bus and coach trip tours, which come through Wakefield. I've eaten rhubarb cheese, rhubarb sausages. You can have rhubarb for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and for starter, main course, and dessert. And it has been, and Wakefield, as the rhubarb capital of Europe, has been a tourist initiative led by Wakefield Council with great success. And there's times when local authorities can make a big difference. In my area as well, we are also now the sculpture centre of Britain because of the Hepworth Gallery and alongside the sculpture park. The Hepworth Gallery would not have happened without the leadership of Peter Box and Joanne Rooney and our local authority, and it will transform our community for the long term because of what they did. Absolutely a brilliant thing. However, what I would say is that local authorities are an important part of a tourism strategy, but it doesn't really make sense for us to have 150 different ones. And therefore, there's some areas of policy where, it's right that it's not decided in Whitehall, but you have to find a way to work together. So therefore, it makes much more sense that we have a tourism strategy for Yorkshire in which different local authorities fit in with their contributions, rather than trying to fund a different tourism strategy, including a marketing communications campaign for every local authority. That was being led by the Regional Development Agency, one of the reasons why I regret that they were abolished.
Unfortunately, time has
Can we not do a
beaten
couple
us.
more? Can we not do any more?
No, because we've got to go into the next session.
Are you sure? Okay, fine.
Yeah. It's the problem, it's time.
Checking. Oh, I'm fine.
I would love to stay here, Ed, and you answer all the questions, but unfortunately time has beaten us and I'll be accused of political bias.
Political bias by stopping me answering the difficult questions.
Well, I hope everybody knows this, I specifically asked somebody to ask a question of Ed who was not a member of the Labour Party. And the Labour activist, I can't see the Labour activist because of the podium, that is a rigid podium this year. What a lot of people don't realise is that, and I hope Ed doesn't mind me saying this, but I think it's important to just say it. The events, the financial events overnight are such that there's been tremendous pressure on Ed, not in fact to honour this engagement, but Ed insisted that his priority was to come here to talk about finance and local government, especially in the light of the LGA report this week. I think he deserves a round of applause for that.